The root of most religious and moral deviations in the younger generation must be sought in their thoughts and beliefs. If a generation's religious conscience is not guided by a foundation of logic and reason, it becomes exceptionally vulnerable. The greater a problem is in this respect, that is, the more it is rooted in intellectual understanding, the more it requires logical and rational comprehension. In our time, any individual who feels this generation is not, at first glance, prepared to receive religious truths must acknowledge that they do not have the necessary readiness for it. The objective of the modern writers and the intellectual group of the Islamic Association of Physicians in addressing and publishing the issue of hijab stems from a sense of duty arising from the numerous deviations that have emerged concerning this matter and others. Part 1. The History of Hijab. Our knowledge of the historical dimension of the hijab is not complete. However, the available evidence allows us to affirm that the practice of veiling existed among some nations before the advent of Islam. What is certain is that in ancient Iran, among the Jewish people, and likely in India, the hijab was practiced, and it was often stricter than what Islam later prescribed. In pre-Islamic Arabia, during the era known as Jahiliyyah, the hijab did not exist, and it was introduced through Islam. Wilderabt, in Volume 12 of The Story of Civilization, references the Talmudic law regarding the Jewish people, stating that if a woman violated Jewish law, for example, by going out among people without a covering on your head, her husband had the right to divorce her without paying the dowry or mahar. This demonstrates that veiling was a common practice among the Jews. Historical sources indicate that in ancient Iran, veiling was also severe and strictly observed. As noted, the hijab in these non-Islamic nations was more restrictive than in Islam. While in Islam, the covering of the face and hands is not obligatory, among other nations, the covering of the face was a fundamental part of the hijab. In Volume 1 of The Story of Civilization, Wilderabt discusses the Jewish people and their laws on this matter, writing that if a woman violated the law of modesty, for instance if she spoke with a man in the street, or if she spun thread in public, or if she raised her voice so that her neighbors could hear her, her husband was permitted to divorce her without paying her dowry or mahar. This confirms that the practice of veiling was not only present but strictly enforced among the Jews. Similarly, the hijab was rigorously practiced in ancient Iran. Some historians even suggest that the strictness of the Iranian hijab during the Sasanian period was a source of pride and was seen as a sign of women's dignity. It is clear that the contact between the Arabs and Iranians after the advent of Islam did not introduce the hijab to the Iranians. On the contrary, some scholars argue that the Iranians' emphasis on veiling influenced the Arabs. Therefore, the historical evidence suggests that the concept of veiling predates Islam and was present in various forms across different cultures, including ancient Iran, India, and among the Jewish people. Islam did not invent hijab, but rather integrated and defined its practice within a new philosophical and social framework. The reasons for its emergence and its Islamic philosophy will be explored in the next part of this audiobook. The world has known the veil, and Islam was not its originator. However, the question of whether the boundaries of Islamic hijab are identical to those practiced in ancient nations is a separate matter. The philosophical and logical reasoning behind the Islamic perspective on the veil and the reasons for its emergence in different parts of the world are topics that we will explore in subsequent sections.
What is the cause and philosophy behind the emergence of the hijab? How did this practice, whether among ancient nations or within Islam, come to be? Opponents of the hijab have often presented various unjust explanations for its origins. They have striven to portray it as the result of oppressive and misguided historical currents. It is undeniable that some of the philosophies they attribute to the hijab's origins are dark and based on flawed reasoning. Here we will summarize the primary causes that have been cited for the emergence of the hijab. These theories are rooted in philosophical, social, economic, ethical, and psychological grounds. After presenting them, we will proceed to analyze their validity. The causes most commonly cited are a tendency toward asceticism and monasticism, the philosophical route, a lack of security and the need to prevent injustice, the social route, the economic exploitation of women by men, the economic route, male jealousy and possessiveness, the ethical route, the belief in women's impurity during their feminine custom, menstruation, the psychological route, the strategy of increasing a woman's value by making her less accessible, a social psychological tactic. We will now examine each of these theories in detail. 1. The tendency toward asceticism and monasticism. The connection between veiling and the philosophy of asceticism and monasticism stems from the idea that the greatest human desire is the pursuit of pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure. Ascetic philosophies, which advocate for the suppression of worldly desires, naturally seek to combat this powerful instinct. Adherents of this philosophy believe that for a person to attain spiritual purity and true communion with the divine, they must completely detach themselves from physical pleasures. They view love and marriage as fundamentally incompatible with the spiritual path. Thus, they argue that the practice of veiling was instituted to prevent the stimulation of desire and to keep men and women from being drawn to one another. Bertrand Russell, in his book Marriage and Morals, argues that religion has historically been hostile to sexuality, with the exception of its role in procreation. He writes that the early Christian fathers, especially St. Paul, viewed sexuality as a corrupting force. This anti-sexual sentiment became deeply embedded in Christian ethics, leading to a belief that celibacy was superior to marriage. This perspective, which sees the body as a prison for the soul, naturally promotes practices like veiling to minimize temptation. This ascetic view, which seeks to suppress all forms of physical pleasure, has appeared in various forms throughout history, from the Cynics in ancient Greece to the Manichaeans and certain Christian monastic traditions. It is this philosophical root that some attribute as the primary cause for the emergence of the hijab. 2. Lack of security. Another theory posits that the hijab emerged not from philosophical or religious principles, but from a practical lack of security in ancient societies. In times of widespread lawlessness, chaos, and social instability, the powerful would often prey on the weak. Abduction and assault were common threats, and since women were physically more vulnerable, they were the primary targets. In such an environment, people sought ways to protect their women from the gaze of powerful men and local rulers. The solution was to keep them concealed within the home, or, when they had to go out, to cover them completely so that their beauty would not attract unwanted attention. This theory suggests that the hijab was a tool for safeguarding women in a violent and insecure world. As societies became more stable and governed by law, this practice should have disappeared, but it persisted as a custom. 3. Economic exploitation of woman. Some have argued, from a Marxist perspective, that history is defined by the exploitation of one class by another. They extend this logic to the relationship between men and women, asserting that since the dawn of private ownership, men have sought to economically exploit women. According to this view, men turned women into their personal and exclusive laborers by confining them to the home. By imposing the hijab, they ensured that women remained isolated from society and dependent on them, thereby transforming them into unpaid servants who would manage the household and raise children. The veil in this interpretation is nothing more than a tool used by the dominant gender to secure their economic interests and subjugate the other.
4. Jealousy. Another theory traces the origin of the hijab to a more personal and psychological root, male jealousy. Proponents of this view argue that men have historically sought to possess women exclusively, preventing any other man from having any form of connection with them. This possessiveness, they claim, is not just about preventing sexual intimacy, but extends to even a simple glance or conversation. This intense jealousy, rooted in a desire for absolute ownership, led men to confine women to the home and to veil them when in public. The hijab, therefore, is seen as a manifestation of a patriarchal desire to control and isolate women, born from an instinct of possessiveness. 5. The feminine custom, menstruation. In many ancient cultures, menstruation was viewed as a state of impurity and uncleanness. A menstruating woman was often seen as unclean and was socially ostracized during her cycle. She was secluded, and others would avoid contact with her, believing her to be a source of bad luck or spiritual contamination. This theory suggests that this temporary seclusion gradually evolved into a permanent practice. The idea of female impurity became so ingrained that women were kept in a state of semi-permanent isolation, which eventually led to the custom of veiling as a way to manage this perceived uncleanness. 6. Increasing a woman's value. This final theory offers a more subtle and socio-psychological explanation. It posits that the hijab was not imposed out of asceticism, fear, or jealousy, but as a tactic to increase a woman's social value and heighten a man's desire for her. The logic is that human beings are naturally more drawn to what is mysterious, hidden, and difficult to attain. When a woman is veiled and remains modest, she creates an aura of dignity and unavailability. This elevates her status from being easily accessible to being something precious that must be earned through respect and proper channels, such as marriage. Love, passion, and the poetic imagination are all fueled by this sense of mystery and distance. The veil, by creating a barrier, transforms a simple physical attraction into a deeper, more profound emotional connection. By making herself less accessible, a woman not only preserves her own dignity, but also elevates herself in the eyes of men, ensuring that she is valued for more than just her physical appearance.
Part 3. The philosophy of covering in Islam. Having examined the various historical and psychological theories for the emergence of the veil, we now turn to the Islamic perspective. The Islamic philosophy of veiling in Islam is not based on the theories we have previously discussed, such as asceticism, lack of security, economic exploitation, or male jealousy. Instead, it is rooted in a more nuanced understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The Islamic view on covering is multifaceted, but it primarily revolves around several key principles. 1. Psychological tranquility for both men and women. Islam recognizes that the sexual instinct is one of the most powerful and profound human drives. It is not merely a physical urge, but is deeply intertwined with our emotional and spiritual lives. If this instinct is left unregulated and is constantly stimulated, it can lead to social and psychological turmoil. When society allows for unrestricted mixing and immodest dress, the sexual instinct is perpetually aroused. This creates a state of constant sensory agitation, where the mind is preoccupied with sensual thoughts, and deeper intellectual and spiritual pursuits are neglected. The result is a society where love becomes shallow, relationships become unstable, and a sense of inner peace is lost. The purpose of the Islamic dress code is to create a social environment where this instinct is channeled in a healthy and constructive manner, primarily within the institution of marriage. By encouraging modesty in public, Islam aims to reduce the constant sexual tension that can dominate a society, allowing both men and women to focus on their broader intellectual, social, and spiritual development. The goal is to bring tranquility to the human spirit and to society as a whole. Strengthening the family unit. The family is the cornerstone of a healthy society, and Islam places emphasis on protecting its sanctity. The philosophy of veiling is directly linked to the preservation of the family unit. When sexual attraction is freely available outside the home, the marital bond is weakened. The exclusive emotional and physical connection that should exist between a husband and wife is diluted when both are exposed to constant external temptations. This can lead to infidelity, emotional distance, and ultimately the breakdown of the family. By limiting sexual expression to the marital relationship, Islamic dress code strengthens the bond between spouses. It ensures that the home remains the center of emotional and physical intimacy, making the family a sanctuary of peace and affection. This fosters a stable environment for raising children and maintains the social fabric. Upholding the woman's social value. Contrary to the claim that the veil is a tool of oppression, Islam views it as a means of elevating a woman's true social value. In a society where women are encouraged to display their physical beauty, their worth is often reduced to their appearance. They become objects of visual pleasure, and their intellectual, spiritual, and professional contributions are often overlooked. The Islamic covering shifts the focus from a woman's physical attributes to her character, knowledge, and actions. By veiling, a woman signals that she wishes to be judged not by her appearance, but by her intellect and personality. This allows her to engage in society on her own terms, as a complete human being, rather than as a sexual object. It is a declaration of independence from the male gaze, asserting that her body is not public property to be consumed by strangers. This in turn fosters a greater respect for women in society and allows them to achieve their full potential without being subjected to objectification. The Islamic perspective on free interaction. Islam is not opposed to the participation of women in society. The Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are filled with examples of women actively participating in social, economic, and even political life. The issue is not whether women should participate, but how. The Islamic model advocates for a society where interactions between men and women are based on respect and dignity, free from the undercurrent of sexual tension. The veil is a tool to facilitate this. It allows for serious, professional, and respectful interactions by minimizing the distractions that can arise from physical attraction. In summary, the philosophy of veiling in Islam is not about suppression, but about creating a balanced and healthy society. It aims to bring psychological tranquility, strengthen the family unit, and elevate the true value of women. It is a system designed to channel human instincts in a way that promotes both individual growth and social harmony, ensuring that relationships are built on a foundation of respect, love, and spiritual connection.
Part 4. Objections and Criticisms. Having outlined the philosophy of covering in Islam, we now address the common objections and criticisms raised against it. These arguments often portray the hijab as an illogical, impractical, or oppressive practice. We will examine each of these criticisms in detail. Objection 1. Hijab and the principle of freedom. The most frequent objection is that the hijab infringes upon a woman's fundamental right to freedom. Critics argue that forcing a woman to cover herself is a form of coercion that denies her personal liberty and the right to choose her own attire. They ask, why should woman's freedom be restricted for the sake of a man's spiritual or moral purity? Response. This argument misunderstands the nature of freedom in a social context. Individual liberty is not absolute. It is limited by the rights and well-being of others. Just as freedom of speech does not permit slander, and freedom of action does not permit harm, a person's freedom of dress must also be considered in light of its impact on society. Islam recognizes that immodest dress can disrupt social and psychological tranquility, weaken the family structure, and lead to the objectification of women. Therefore, the requirement of veiling is not about limiting a woman's freedom for a man's sake, but about establishing a social framework that protects the rights and well-being of everyone, men, women, and the family unit. Furthermore, the hijab can be seen as a form of liberation. It frees a woman from the societal pressure to conform to ever-changing beauty standards and allows her to be valued for her intellect and character rather than her physical appearance. It is a declaration that she is not an object to be consumed by the public gaze. Objection 2. The stagnation of talents. Another common criticism is that the hijab leads to the stagnation of a woman's talents by isolating her from society. Critics argue that by confining women to the home or restricting their public presence, the veil prevents them from participating in cultural, social, and economic activities, effectively removing half of the population from the workforce and hindering societal progress. Response: this objection is based on a false premise that Islamic covering is synonymous with complete seclusion. Islam does not mandate that women remain isolated at home. The Quran and Islamic history are replete with examples of women who were active in various fields, including commerce, education, and even politics, all while observing the principles of modest dress. The purpose of the hijab is not to prevent a woman from participating in society, but to define the manner of her participation. It is intended to create an environment where her interactions are serious, respectful, and free from sexual objectification. A woman in hijab can attend universities, work in professions, and contribute to society in countless ways. The real cause of stagnation is not the veil itself, but rather the cultural misinterpretations that have sometimes led to extreme forms of seclusion. The Islamic ideal is a society where both men and women contribute their talents, and the hijab is a means to ensure that this contribution is made in a dignified and productive manner. Objection 3. Increased excitement and hunger. Some argued that the hijab, by creating a separation between the sexes, actually increases sexual tension and desire. They compare it to a forbidden fruit, suggesting that the more something is restricted, the more desirable it becomes. According to this view, the veil creates a psychologically hungry society that is more obsessed with sexuality than a society where interactions are free and open. Response: this argument confuses natural, healthy desire with constant, obsessive agitation. There is a significant difference between the sexual instinct as a managed, channeled force and as an unchecked, perpetually stimulated one. In societies with unrestricted mixing and immodest dress, the senses are constantly bombarded with sexual stimuli. This does not lead to a healthy satisfaction of desire, but to a state of perpetual restlessness and a devaluing of genuine emotional connection. Intimacy becomes cheapened, and the constant exposure leads to a search for ever more extreme forms of stimulation. The Islamic approach, by contrast, seeks to create a balance. By encouraging modesty in the public, it reduces the constant sensory overload, allowing the sexual instinct to be expressed in its proper context, the marital relationship. This does not eliminate desire, but rather elevates it, making it a source of deep emotional and spiritual bonding rather than a source of social chaos. The goal is not to create a hungry society, but a tranquil one, where desire is honored and channeled constructively. In conclusion, the criticisms against the hijab often stem from a misunderstanding of its philosophy and purpose. The Islamic covering is not intended to oppress women, stifle their talents, or create a repressed society. Rather,
It is part of a comprehensive social system designed to protect the dignity of both men and women, strengthen the family, and foster a healthy, balanced, and spiritually oriented community.
Part 5. The Islamic Hijab. The discussion of hijab in Islam is primarily based on several key verses from the Quran. Our analysis begins with Surah An-Nur, the chapter of light, which contains the most detailed instructions regarding modesty and covering. 1. The verses on seeking permission, or istidan. Before addressing the specifics of dress, the Quran establishes the principle of privacy. In verses 27 and 29 of Surah An-Nur, it is stated, "O you who have believed, do not enter houses other than your own until you have sought permission and greeted their inhabitants. That is best for you. Perhaps you will be mindful. And if you find no one therein, do not enter them until permission has been given you. And if you are told, go back, then go back. It is purer for you, and Allah is knowing of what you do." These verses establish the sanctity of the private home and are a prelude to the verses on modesty, as the philosophy of covering is deeply connected to the concept of a protected and private space. 2. The verses on lowering the gaze and covering. The most explicit verses concerning the hijab are found in Surah An-Nur, verses 30 and 31. It is crucial to note that the command begins with men. Verse 30, for men. Tell the believing men to lower their gaze and guard their chastity. That is pure for them. Indeed, Allah is acquainted with what they do. This verse establishes a mutual responsibility. The burden of modesty does not fall on women alone. Men are first commanded to control their own gaze, which is the primary step in maintaining a chaste and respectful society. Verse 31, for women. This is the most comprehensive verse on the topic of women's covering. It states, "And tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their chastity, and not to display their adornment, or zina, except that which ordinarily appears thereof, and let them draw their head coverings, or kumur, over their chests, and not display their adornment except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers' sons, their sisters' sons, their women, that which their right hands possess, or those male attendants having no physical desire, or children who are not yet aware of the private aspects of women, and let them not stamp their feet to make known what they conceal of their adornment, and turn to Allah in repentance, all of you, O believers, that you might succeed." Analysis of key terms in verse 31. Adornment, or zina. This term refers to two things: a woman's natural beauty and the artificial decorations she uses, such as jewelry, kohl, and henna. This verse commands that these should not be displayed, except that which ordinarily appears thereof. This clause is the basis for much juristic discussion. It provides an exception for the parts of a woman's adornment that are naturally visible or difficult to conceal. The most common interpretation among jurists is that this refers to the face and hands. Head coverings, or kumur. The word kumur is the plural of kimar, which means a head covering. In pre-Islamic Arabia, women would wear head coverings, but would often let the ends hang down their backs, leaving their necks and the upper parts of their chests exposed.
This verse commands them to draw their head coverings forward to cover these areas. This is a clear and direct instruction regarding the manner of veiling. The list of exceptions, mahrim, the verse then lists the categories of men before whom a woman is not required to observe the full hijab. These are her close, unmarriageable relatives, or mahrim, with whom marriage is permanently forbidden. 3. The verse of the outer garment. Another key verse is found in Surah Al-Ahzab, the chapter of the clans, verse 59. O Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers to bring down over themselves part of their outer garments, or jalabib. That is more suitable so that they will be known and not be abused, and ever is Allah forgiving and merciful. Analysis of jalabib. The word jalabilb is the plural of gelbab, which refers to a loose outer garment that covers the entire body. The verse indicates that the purpose of this garment is twofold: for believing women to be known or recognized as respectable, chaste women, and thereby not be abused or harassed. This verse adds another dimension to the philosophy of hijab. It is not only a matter of personal modesty, but also a social signifier that protects a woman from unwanted attention and affirms her dignified status in society. In summary, the Islamic hijab, as detailed in the Quran, is a comprehensive code of modesty for both men and women. For women, it consists of lowering the gaze, guarding their chastity, and covering their adornment with a head covering, or khimar, and, when in public, an outer garment, or a jilbab, leaving only the face and hands visible. This practice is rooted in the principles of maintaining social tranquility, protecting the family, and, most importantly, upholding the dignity and value of the woman as a human being.
Further discussions: the limits of the Islamic covering. Having established the foundational Quranic verses regarding hijab, we now delve into one of the most critical jurisprudential questions: what are the precise limits of the covering required in Islam? Specifically, is it obligatory to cover the face and hands? The verses in Surah An-Nur command women not to display their adornment, zina, except that which appears thereof. While there is a near unanimous consensus among Islamic scholars that covering the hair is obligatory, the debate has centered on whether the face and hands fall under this exception. The majority view the face and hands are exempt. The majority of Islamic jurists, fuqaha, both in the past and today, hold the view that it is not obligatory for a woman to cover her face and hands. Their primary evidence is the exception clause in Surah An-Nur, except that which appears thereof. They argue that this phrase naturally refers to the parts of the body that are customarily exposed in daily life and are necessary for interaction and work, namely the face and the hands, up to the wrists. Number one, practical necessity. Life requires interaction. A woman needs her hands to give and take and her face to be identified. Covering these would impose an undue hardship, or haraj, which goes against a fundamental principle of Islamic law. The Quran itself is a book of guidance for life, and it is unreasonable to assume it would prescribe a rule that makes normal life impractical. Number two, context of revelation. The command to draw their head coverings over their chests was revealed to reform an existing practice. Pre-Islamic Arab women already wore headscarves but left their necks and chests exposed.
The Quranic instruction was to correct this by extending the existing covering, not to introduce the covering of the face, which was not the prevailing custom. Number 3, narrations, or hadith. Numerous narrations from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions support this view. For example, a well-known narration involving Asma, the daughter of Abu Bakr, reports that when she entered upon the Prophet wearing thin clothing, he turned away and said, "O Asma, when a woman reaches the age of menstruation, it is not proper for her to show any part of her body except this, and he pointed to his face and hands." While the authenticity of this particular hadith is debated by some scholars, its content is consistent with the interpretation of many other sources. Therefore, according to the majority of scholars, the Islamic hijab consists of covering the entire body and hair, with the explicit exception of the face and hands. The minority view, the covering of the face and hands is obligatory, or at the very least highly recommended, especially in times of moral decline. Their reasoning includes, number 1, the face as the primary site of adornment. They argue that the face is the greatest source of a woman's beauty and therefore the primary source of temptation, fitna. To leave it uncovered would seem to contradict the very philosophy of hijab, which is to prevent such temptation. Number 2, interpreting the verse of the jilbab. They interpret the verse in Surah Al-Ahzab to bring down over themselves part of their outer garments as a command to cover the face. They argue that this was a later revelation that specified the need for a more complete covering in public. Number 3, the principle of blocking the means, or Sad al-Darai. This legal principle suggests that anything that is likely to lead to something forbidden, haram, should itself be prohibited. Since an uncovered face might lead to forbidden glances or thoughts, these scholars argue that it must be covered as a preventive measure. Conclusion on the limits of hijab. While respecting the minority opinion, the evidence strongly supports the majority view that the covering of the face and hands is not an intrinsic part of the obligatory Islamic hijab. The philosophy of hijab is not about erasing a woman's identity, but about shifting the focus from her physical appearance to her character and intellect. By leaving the face and hands uncovered, Islam allows for personal identification and normal interaction, while still maintaining the principles of modesty and dignity. The emphasis is on a state of being, chaste, dignified, and respected, not on a rigid and impractical uniformity.
Further discussions examining the opposing evidence. To present a balanced and comprehensive analysis, we must now address the evidence cited by those who hold the minority view that covering the face is in fact obligatory. These scholars primarily rely on a number of narrations, hadith, that at first glance appear to support their position. 1. The narration of Fadl ibn Abbas. One of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence is a narration from the farewell pilgrimage of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The story involves the Prophet's cousin, a handsome young man named Fadl ibn Abbas, who was riding behind the Prophet on his camel. A woman from the tribe of Hatham, known for her beauty, approached the Prophet to ask a question. Fadl and the woman began to look at one another, captivated by each other's appearance. Noticing this, the Prophet Muhammad reached back and gently turned Fadl's face away to prevent him from staring at the woman. Analysis. Proponents of the face veil argue that this incident demonstrates the necessity of covering the face to prevent fitna, temptation. They contend that the woman's face had not been a source of attraction. This situation would not have occurred.
However, a closer examination reveals a different conclusion. The crucial action taken by the Prophet was not to order the woman to cover her face, but to turn away Fatal's gaze. This implies that the primary responsibility in this instance was placed on the man to control his looking. If covering the face were an absolute obligation, the Prophet would almost certainly have instructed the woman to do so. His deliberate choice to redirect the man's gaze instead is a powerful indication that the woman was not in violation of a required Islamic dress code. This narration, therefore, actually strengthens the argument that men are responsible for their gaze rather than proving the obligation of the face veil for women. 2. The narration on impermissible glances. Another argument is based on narrations that forbid a man from looking at a non-mahram, unmarriageable relative woman. Proponents of face covering argue that since the face is the primary object of looking, these prohibitions must logically include a prohibition against looking at the face. If looking at the face is forbidden, then it follows that the face must be covered. Analysis. This argument rests on a flawed premise. Islamic law makes a clear distinction between an incidental, unintentional glance and a deliberate, lustful stare. The narrations that forbid looking are almost universally understood to be prohibiting the latter. The Quran itself commands men to lower their gaze, which implies that there is something permissible to be seen, from which the gaze must then be lowered. If everything were required to be covered, the command would be redundant. The instruction is not to walk around with one's eyes closed, but to avert one's gaze from anything that might lead to inappropriate thoughts. Therefore, the prohibition is on the act of staring with desire, not on the mere fact of the face being visible. This is a crucial distinction that is often overlooked. 3. The concept of tabarruj, seductive display. The Quran forbids women from engaging in tabarruj, a term that refers to an ostentatious or seductive display of beauty, similar to the practices of the pre-Islamic era. Some scholars argue that uncovering the face constitutes a form of tabarruj. Analysis. This interpretation extends the meaning of tabarruj beyond its intended scope. Tabarruj does not refer to the normal appearance of a woman with her face and hands uncovered. It refers to an intentional and provocative display of adornment and beauty designed to attract illicit attention. This includes heavy makeup, suggestive clothing, and an alluring demeanor. The simple act of leaving the face uncovered in the course of normal daily life does not fall under this category. To equate the two is to misunderstand the Quranic prohibition, which is aimed at preventing seductive behavior, not at mandating the concealment of a woman's identity. Conclusion on the opposing evidence. While the narrations cited by the proponents of the face veil rightly emphasize the importance of modesty, chastity, and avoiding temptation, they do not provide explicit and unequivocal evidence for the obligation of covering the face. A careful examination reveals that these sources are either misinterpreted or do not lead to the definitive conclusion that the face veil is a religious requirement. The stronger, more consistent evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah points to the majority view that the Islamic hijab requires a woman to cover her hair and body while leaving her face and hands uncovered, allowing her to be both modest and a fully participating member of society.
Further discussions. The participation of women in society. One of the most critical questions in the discussion of hijab is its implication for a woman's role in society. Does Islam advocate for the seclusion of women, confining them to their homes, or does it envision an active, participatory role for them in public life? The answer is unequivocally the latter. Islam does not support the confinement of women. The philosophy of the Islamic covering is not to isolate women, but to provide the framework for their dignified and effective participation in society. Neither seclusion nor unrestricted mixing. The Islamic model for social interaction presents a middle path between two extremes: total seclusion, the historical practice in some cultures, such as ancient Iran or Athens, of keeping women completely hidden from public life, or unrestricted mixing, the modern Western model, which often involves the free and unregulated intermingling of the sexes, frequently leading to the objectification of women and the weakening of the family unit. Islam rejects both of these extremes. It establishes a social structure where women are encouraged to participate in all constructive aspects of society, education, commerce, politics, and worship, while maintaining the boundaries of modesty and dignity that protect both them and the social fabric. The hijab is not a barrier to participation. It is the very tool that makes healthy and respectful participation possible. Historical evidence from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the early Muslim community. The strongest evidence against the idea of seclusion comes from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the early Muslim community. History shows that women were not confined to their homes. Attendance at the mosque. The mosque during the Prophet's time was the central hub of the community. It was not just a place of worship, but also a center for learning, governance, and social gatherings. Women actively attended congregational prayers and sermons, standing in rows behind the men. The Prophet himself designated a separate door for women to enter and exit the mosque to prevent undue crowding and maintain decorum, which in itself proves their regular attendance. Participation in public life. Women would come to the Prophet in public to ask questions about religious and personal matters. They engaged in commerce in the marketplaces. They participated in battles, not as combatants, but in crucial support roles, such as providing water, tending to the wounded, and encouraging the soldiers. These historical facts make it clear that the Islamic ideal is not one of seclusion. The Quranic guideline for interaction. While Islam encourages women's participation, it also provides guidelines for the nature of that interaction. For instance, in Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 32, the wives of the Prophet are addressed with a principle that is general in its spirit. Then do not be soft in speech to men, lest he in whose heart is a disease should covet, but speak with appropriate speech. This verse does not forbid women from speaking to men. On the contrary, it affirms that they will speak to men, but instructs them to do so in a manner that is dignified, serious, and not seductive. It sets the tone for a respectful and professional interaction free from flirting. Conclusion: a society of dignified participation. The Islamic philosophy of social interaction is not about building a wall between men and women. It is about building a society where both can contribute their talents and fulfill their potential without compromising their dignity or the sanctity of the family. The hijab is not a sign of confinement. It is the uniform for active social participation. It allows a woman to be judged for her mind, not her body, and to engage with the world on her own terms, secure in her identity, and respected for her contributions. Islam does not say that a woman must remain hidden at home. It says that when she goes out into society, she must do so with dignity, modesty, and purpose.
Further discussions. Fatwa, Islamic legal rulings, and specific issues. Having established the principles of modesty and social participation, we now turn to the specific legal rulings, or fatwa, that govern the interaction between men and women in Islam. These rulings are not arbitrary. They are the practical application of the philosophy we have discussed, derived from the Quran and the Sunnah. 1. The meaning of Awrah. A foundational concept in these discussions is Awrah. The term Awrah refers to the parts of the body that must be covered out of modesty. It is crucial to understand that Islamic jurisprudence defines Awrah differently in two separate contexts. A. Awrah in the prayer or salah. When a woman stands for prayer, she must cover her entire body except her face, her hands up to the wrists, and her feet up to the ankles. This is a requirement for the validity of her prayer, even if she is praying completely alone. B. Awrah in front of non-mahram men. This refers to the parts of her body that must be covered in the presence of men who are not her close, unmarriageable relatives. This is the context relevant to our discussion of social hijab. The consensus among the vast majority of scholars is that the awrah in this second context is the same as the first, the entire body with the exception of the face and hands. Therefore, the very definition of awrah in jurisprudence already contains the exemption for the face and hands, reinforcing the view that covering them is not obligatory. 2. The issue of a woman's voice. A common question that arises is whether a woman's voice is considered part of her awrah. Is it permissible for a non-mahram man to hear a woman's voice? The consensus among Islamic scholars is that a woman's voice is not awrah. It is not inherently forbidden for a man to hear it. The evidence for this is overwhelming. Throughout Islamic history, women spoke to the Prophet, asked questions of scholars, engaged in commerce, and testified in court, all of which required their voices to be heard by men. However, as we discussed earlier, the Quran provides a crucial guideline in Surah Al-Ahzab. Do not be soft in speech. This clarifies that while the voice itself is not forbidden, the manner of speaking is important. The prohibition is against using a tone that is intentionally soft, alluring, or flirtatious, which could create temptation. A woman should speak in a manner that is normal, dignified, and appropriate for the context, whether it be educational, professional, or transactional. 3. The issue of shaking hands, or musafaha. Another practical issue is that of physical contact, specifically shaking hands between non-mahram men and women. The established ruling in Islamic jurisprudence is that such contact is not permissible. The philosophy behind this prohibition is rooted in the principle of blocking the means, or saddl zara'i, which means closing the door to anything that could lead to greater temptation or sin. While a simple handshake may seem innocent in itself, it is a form of physical contact that can easily cross the line from a formal greeting into something more familiar. Islam seeks to maintain clear and unambiguous boundaries in the relationship between non-mahram men and women. The prohibition on physical contact is a preventative measure designed to preserve the formal, respectful nature of their interactions and to prevent the development of inappropriate intimacy. It ensures that the only sanctioned physical intimacy is within the sacred bond of marriage. In conclusion, these specific rulings on the limits of covering the voice and physical contact are not isolated commands. They are integral parts of a coherent system designed to foster a society built on modesty, respect, and the protection of the family. They provide the practical framework that allows men and women to interact and contribute to society in a manner that upholds their dignity and prevents the social harms that arise from unregulated intermingling.
Further discussions: concealment or expression, al-kitman al-izar. We have arrived at a profound psychological objection, one that strikes at the very heart of the philosophy of modesty. Modern psychology, particularly Freudian psychoanalysis, has popularized the idea that the suppression of natural instincts leads to psychological complexes, disorders, and anxieties. The argument presented is this: the need for self-display, the desire to be seen and admired, and the sexual instinct itself are all natural and powerful human drives. If these instincts are suppressed, if they are concealed rather than expressed, they will not disappear. Instead, they will manifest in harmful, distorted ways, leading to mental and emotional illness. Therefore, the argument concludes, the Islamic call for modesty, chastity, afa, and veiling is a call for suppression and is, therefore, psychologically damaging.
Is it not healthier to allow these instincts to be expressed freely and openly? The Islamic response: the critical difference between management and suppression. This objection is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. It conflates two entirely different concepts: suppression, qabd, and management or control, afa or chastity. Islam does not advocate for the suppression of natural instincts. The Quran and the teachings of the Prophet recognize the sexual drive, the need for love, and the appreciation of beauty as natural, God-given parts of human nature. They are not seen as inherently evil or dirty. To attempt to eradicate these instincts would be to fight against human nature itself, and Islam does not command this. What Islam advocates for is the management and channeling of these powerful instincts. The concept of afa, chastity, modesty, self-control, is not about destroying desire, but about refining it and directing it toward its proper and fulfilling context, the sacred institution of marriage. Think of a powerful spring of water. If you try to block it completely, suppression, the pressure will build until it bursts forth in a destructive flood. If you let it flow unregulated in every direction, it will create a stagnant, muddy swamp. The wise approach is to dig a channel, directing the water to irrigate fields, power mills, and bring life. The human sexual and emotional instinct is like this spring. Islam does not seek to block it, it seeks to channel it. Modesty and the hijab are the banks of this channel, guiding the powerful energy of human affection and desire toward the family, where it can foster deep love, loyalty, and stability. Does unrestricted expression lead to satisfaction? The premise of the objection itself is flawed. Does a society of unrestricted sexual display and interaction actually lead to satisfaction and tranquility? Experience and observation suggest the opposite. When the sexual instinct is constantly stimulated from all directions, it does not become satisfied. It becomes inflamed and insatiable. The constant bombardment of sensual images and interactions leads to a state of perpetual psychological agitation, not peace. Love is cheapened, relationships become transient, and the deep spiritual need for connection is replaced by a shallow, fleeting pursuit of physical pleasure. Unrestricted expression does not quench the thirst, it makes it more intense and spreads it aimlessly. The Islamic approach, on the other hand, preserves the intensity and value of this instinct for the marital relationship. By limiting its expression in public, Islam ensures that the bond between spouses remains the primary focus of emotional and physical intimacy, making it stronger, deeper, and more fulfilling. In conclusion, the Islamic call to modesty is not a call for the suppression of instincts, which is indeed harmful. It is a call to the discipline and refinement of those instincts. It is a form of spiritual and psychological training that strengthens the human will, elevates the soul, and directs our most powerful energies toward building stable families and a tranquil society. It does not seek to destroy desire, but to honor it by giving it its proper and dignified place.
Concluding discussions, 2 other issues. To complete our exploration of the practical application of hijab, we will now address 2 specific issues that frequently arise in daily interactions: the ruling on a man hearing a woman's voice and the ruling on shaking hands with a non-mahram. 1. The issue of a woman's voice. Is a woman's voice considered part of her Awrah, that which must be concealed? Is it permissible for a man who is not her mahram to hear her voice? The consensus among Islamic scholars is that a woman's voice is not Awrah. It is not inherently forbidden for a man to hear it. The evidence for this is overwhelming, drawn from the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Throughout Islamic history, women spoke to the Prophet, asked questions of scholars in public forums,
engaged in commerce in the marketplace, and testified in court, all of which required their voices to be heard by men. However, the permissibility of the voice is conditional. The Quran provides a crucial guideline in Surah Al-Ahzab, where the wives of the Prophet are told, "Then do not be soft in speech to men, lest he in whose heart is a disease should covet, but speak with appropriate speech." Quran 33:32. This verse clarifies that while the voice itself is not forbidden, the manner of speaking is of great importance. The prohibition is against using a tone that is intentionally soft, alluring, flirtatious, or seductive, which could create temptation or fitna in the heart of the listener. Therefore, a woman is encouraged to speak in a manner that is normal, dignified, and appropriate for the context. The ruling is not about silence, but about the quality and intention of the speech. It is a call for communication that is respectful, serious, and devoid of any seductive undertones. 2. The issue of shaking hands, musafaha. The second issue concerns physical contact, specifically the act of shaking hands between men and women who are not mahram to each other. The established ruling in Islamic jurisprudence is that such direct physical contact is not permissible. The philosophy behind this prohibition is rooted in the important legal principle of blocking the means, or sad ad-darai. This principle dictates that if an action, even if seemingly innocent in itself, is likely to lead to something forbidden, or haram, then that action should be prohibited as a preventative measure. A simple handshake might appear to be a harmless formal greeting in many cultures. However, it is a form of physical contact, and Islam seeks to maintain clear and unambiguous boundaries in the relationship between non-mahram men and women. The prohibition on physical contact is a safeguard designed to prevent the development of inappropriate familiarity or intimacy. It ensures that interactions remain in the realm of respect and professionalism, closing the door to potential temptations that can begin with simple physical touch. This ruling reinforces the Islamic principle that the only sanctioned and celebrated physical intimacy is within the sacred bond of marriage. By setting these clear boundaries, Islam aims to protect both individuals and the integrity of the family unit from the potential harms that can arise when these lines become blurred.